Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about sort of the first major normative theory, which is virtue ethics. And first, in terms of for our class, but rather than just focus on Aristotelian virtue ethics, which is kind of, one of the big three that's alive today, it's the smallest position, but it's one of the big three. I also want to talk about some of the other ancient Greek theories that are happening at the same time historically, and it will kind of help to draw a little bit of contrast between the multiple theories. So I'm going to call this ancient Greek virtue ethics as opposed to just Aristotelian virtue ethics. Okay. And one of the main things that I'm going to do is I'm going to lay out all three theories. I'm going to spend the most time on Aristotle, but I'm also going to set forth the life of Priam, because Priam provides an interesting example to try to see how the theories may or may not judge Priam's life. So, with Greek virtue ethics, there's basically two observations that I think Aristotle made that are crucially important. All right. The first one is that we all want to be happy. And I'll explain what happiness means. But the idea here is we all want to live good or meaningful lives, right? We don't just want to survive, we want to thrive in certain ways. That's what's really important. And it's this vision of a full, flourishing human life that kind of gives us an aspiration or a goal. That's what we want to figure out, all right? And then the second thing, and this is why it's called virtue ethics, and we'll have multiple varieties of virtue ethics, but virtue ethics is about our characters, right? And so the second observation that Aristotle makes is that we all develop habits, okay? And throughout our lives, humans face a certain number of things just by nature of having a human life, okay? And this ingrains in us certain patterns of thinking, feeling, doing, all sorts of things. So whenever we face whatever the situation is, if we face that situation multiple times in life, we're going to naturally develop tendencies within ourselves to think or feel or do certain things, and that's another really important observation. So we all want to live a good life, and we all, through facing certain situations multiple times throughout life, will develop character traits, all right? And that's enough to get virtue ethics off the ground. So let's start with Aristotle. And I've tried to include a quote by each of the philosophers that we're going to talk about tonight. Aristotle is a little bit tough to quote, largely because we think that he wrote in dialogues, kind of like Plato, but none of them survived. And so what we have left are notes that either he or one or more of his students prepared. So honestly, like whenever you're reading Aristotle, it's probably some of the ugliest Greek prose that kind of exists because it's largely notes. It's not refined, it's not, polished or anything like that. That said, I think I've found an appropriate quote for Aristotle and for tonight especially, and this is from his Nicomachean Ethics. And he says, "So far as is possible, assimilate to the immortals and do everything with the aim of living in accordance with what is highest of the things in us. For even if it is small in bulk, the degree it surpasses everything in power and dignity is far and greater." The reason I like this, and there's a bit of a typo, is because Aristotle wants us to be the best we can be. And this isn't necessarily, a high-minded ideal. Some people interpret him this way, but I think that he's actually pretty empirical. He means whenever you're trying to figure out how to live life, and he thinks that the Nicomachean Ethics, rather than settle theoretical debates, what it's meant to do is to help you figure out how to act and how to live well. And what you should do whenever you're living well and ingraining a good character in yourself is you should be minding the highest elements in yourself and trying to be the best that you can and lead the best life that you can. Okay, so what does that mean? One of the big operative ideas is his idea of eudaimonia. And this is a tough term to translate just because there's no one word. You have to translate it in phrases, maybe. Eu in Greek means good. Daimon is something like a spirit. And so you could, like, the clunky translation might be something like a well-ordered spirit or a well-ordered soul. Usually, people translate it as happiness or flourishing. And both translations have their benefits. If you say happiness, the upside of translating it in that way is that we all still care about happiness, right? The pursuit of happiness. The downside is it can make it sound like it's an emotion, and it's not. It is not a short-term emotion. That is not what we're talking about. So flourishing is a good translation because it basically talks about the activity. In order to be eudaimon, right, to have a good soul, you have to be doing things throughout your life. But flourishing also just doesn't sound natural. We don't really talk in terms of flourishing. Maybe we all talk in terms of thriving or something like that. So happiness is usually how people translate it. Eudaimonia, they'll just say it in English, and so that's kind of how it often gets translated. But it's also just like important to stress. This is a long-term accomplishment of an entire life lived well. Like I said, it's not the short-term emotion. It's not a feeling. It's not a mood. This is something that you would ascribe to a life. You would say that person is eudaimon, or they have eudaimonia. They have flourished. And it's because they've developed their self entirely well. Every aspect of themselves seems to be developed pretty well. And they've been able to maintain that enough throughout life such that they've lived a good life. They've been able to balance all the experiences that we think are integral to living a full and flourishing human life. And Aristotle, again, he just says, look, whenever you're, assessing different things in society, one observation that you can make is that some lives are better than others. And I think that this is a really important observation because this isn't like, I don't think it's really all that controversial, although some people try to make it controversial. But it's like, if you could look within your community and you could choose to live a life of just one person within your community, whose life would you want to live? Certainly, you would think that some lives are better than others, okay? And this is what gives rise to the idea that we all want to be happy, but the key is that we disagree on how to be happy. And that's kind of what this lecture is kind of a microcosm of. We have Aristotle, and we also have Epicurus and Epictetus. We have three different people arguing about what they think happiness consists in. There's a good analogy, and this is the analogy of the guitarra player. If you speak Spanish, the guitarra, that's kind of where we get a lot of the words. The guitarra or the guitarra is basically a lyre. It's a harp, it has strings. And he says, if you look at a good harp player or a good lyre player, what you notice is what makes them good is that they can play well, right? And it's not just that they're good from birth or anything like that, but they have to learn throughout time. They've probably learned from other people. That's what's important about this guitarra player analogy. And similarly, he wants to know just how the lyre player has some sort of good function, right? The function of being a lyre player is to be a good lyre player. Well, what is it for a human? If we're a human animal, and presumably all animals have some sort of function, what is it for us? And it's a life according to reason and virtue. So I should have said life according to reason and virtue. That's confusing wording. I apologize for that. Okay? So the idea here is that in order for us to be happy, the short, pithy saying is a life according to reason and virtue. Why? Well, it's because reason in us is our most important faculty. Now, when Aristotle says this, he does not mean to say that we are only rational beings. Something that's really, really important to emphasize with respect to Aristotle is that he has a holistic view of psychology. And in fact, he compares us very often to other animals. He's kind of a biologist in that way. So he says, with plants, for example, they have souls. And their soul allows them to grow and nourish and reproduce. We share that with plants. In order for us to be happy, we have to be able to grow and to nourish and potentially to reproduce, right? With animals, animals now can move around and they can desire certain things. So my dog, she doesn't want to hang out with us. She wants to go hang out on the couch, right? That's a desire that she has. So similarly with us, we have to be able to move around and to interact with the world and to be able to control our desires. So we are continuous with plants and with animals. But what sets us apart, what makes us unique, especially compared to other animals, is that we have this complex sense of reason, and you could add a complex sense of sociality. This is why he talks a lot about friends. So it's this holistic psychological picture. We have to develop all those aspects of ourselves, but reason is still the best thing that we have, and that's why it's running the game. So the function of human beings is living life according to reason and virtue. That's what happiness consists in. And happiness just is the good that is the most self-sufficient, or it's the most complete. It's the intrinsic good. Intrinsic contrasts with instrumental. Instrumental means it's good for some other reason or some other purpose. So if I ask you why you want money or why you want cash, cash is not intrinsically worthwhile. Maybe you could use it to light a fire or something like that, but cash is only worthwhile insofar as it helps you to buy other goods. It's not just something that does you any good sitting around. By contrast, happiness is good in and of itself. In and of itself. If you ask someone why they want to be happy, it doesn't make sense to ask them why, right? It just seems intrinsically worthwhile for someone to be happy. You don't have to ask what ulterior motives could be achieved by being happy. It's just something that's good, okay? And whenever he's trying to figure out what the good in life is, he looks at all of the different possibilities. Is it honor, like maybe a politician would say, like reputation? Is it, courage, like maybe a general would say? Is it pleasure, as some people seem to say? Is it studying, as some intellectuals or philosophers are going to say? So you just put all of these things out there and you try to figure out, well, which one is the thing that we're doing everything for the sake of? And he says, happiness. Happiness. That's why we want happiness. How do we achieve that? How do we accomplish this full, flourishing human life where we're able to interact with the world, where we're able to develop proper desires, where we're able to develop our psychology? Reason is at the head, but we also have good feelings and we have good motivations. Well, that's where virtues come in. So the Greek word here is arete, and that is usually translated as virtue, or it's translated as excellence. So the downside of talking about virtues is that no one talks about virtues. Like we don't usually use that word, right? But it does capture that it's a good character trait. It's something good that we're trying to develop in ourselves. Contemporarily, you often hear it referred to as a good moral character trait. So it's a trait that you develop in yourself that helps you to live well or to do good things. And that's why excellence is often a secondary translation, because whenever you do something excellently, that means that you're doing it well. And arete, well, it has that sense of developing something in yourself that allows you to be and to do good things. So I'm just going to call it virtue, but I figured I would give you that background. There are general patterns in life. And in Book 2, Section 7, he starts to lay out kind of the general patterns of the virtues. Now, I put particularism in parentheses because Aristotle is not a universalist moral philosopher like Immanuel Kant, who's a philosopher that we're going to get later. Okay? What particularism means is you cannot have top-down moral principles really big, grand scale moral things, because the problem is, how do you actually apply those things? Right? How do you get from those big, ideas and apply them to what I should do here and now? So Aristotle isn't really interested in the really high-minded theoretical stuff, at least not in the Nicomachean Ethics, and he's not trying to give these universal values or principles. He's trying to say, here are some general patterns that can help us to live well, things that I've noticed, but there are exceptions to every single rule, and ultimately it comes down to something like experience. Side note, this is why he says that young people, they could potentially be geniuses of mathematics or geometry, right? They can learn that fairly quickly, they can pick it up, but they cannot be geniuses of moral philosophy. And that's because moral philosophy and being ethical and being good, that takes experience. Okay? And so that's what the particularism is about. You can't just abstractly say what someone would say. You have to know who they are. You have to know what society they're in. And you have to know kind of what their character is like in order to be able to give advice. The particularism says it's in the detail. It's in the particulars. It's not in the universals. That's what's really important. So that caveat aside, he still notices that there are good patterns, right? And so for the virtues, you can kind of think that, first of all, you're trying to find certain universal spheres of life or emotions that we all face. So no matter what, we as humans are going to face certain situations. And then, typically, there's going to be an excessive or a deficient way of facing that thing, too much or too little. And what virtue tends to be is the mean between the extremes. It tends to be the sort of Goldilocks zone, not too hot, not too cold. It's something in the middle. He likens it to finding the center of a circle. A lot of ways to go wrong, right? But you kind of aim between all of the extremes to find the mean between the extremes, to find the sort of average, if you want to put it in that way. So for example, fear. Fear is something that we all face, and we face it in many different aspects of our lives. So we face it whenever we're learning a new skill, because we're going to fail, right? We face it in our romantic lives, whenever we decide to ask someone out for a date. We face it in our careers, going through a job interview or asking for a promotion. Fear is just something that we all face. And whether we like it or not, we're going to develop some sort of habit with respect to fear. That's why we have to pay attention. That's why Aristotle is sort of saying you need to figure out how to develop the proper virtues, because if you don't, you risk becoming vicious. All right? And so with courage, it is neither being afraid all the time, okay? So that's the coward, but it's also never being afraid. Right? It's also never the kind of person who never feels fear, because they end up being really rash and doing stupid things. The kind of person there is the person who says, hold my beer, and then does something really stupid, and now you go to like urgent care or the emergency room or whatever, because they're an idiot and they don't listen to it. Courage, instead, is the person who they understand that they feel fear, right? And they use their reason again is at the head, to try and understand what's eliciting the fear. How am I reacting to this? What are my potential ways of interacting with this emotion or what's going on right now? And then you have to decide whether to listen to it and how to engage. The courageous person isn't someone who doesn't feel fear. They feel fear, right? But they don't let it prevent them from doing what they need to do to accomplish things in life. So that's what courage is. And notice again, there's the holistic psychological thing going on here. It's not just, reason. Reason is important, right? It's what allows you to say why you're doing something. If someone asks you, why did you do that thing? You can at least give a little bit of an account. That's as much reason as we need here. Or someone can say, how does this set of actions, or how does your development in this sphere of your life, your professional life, how does it fit in with everything else in your life that you're trying to accomplish? That's the sense of reason that we need. But you also can't ignore emotion. because fear can sometimes give us really important information. Fear was evolutionarily advantageous, right? Aristotle didn't talk in this sense, but we have to understand our fears. And whenever we're developing this in ourselves, it's also really, really important to remember this is a sort of incremental or a developmental view. We are not naturally virtuous. We have to learn to become virtuous through our teachers, through our communities, and through action by action trying to become better. So if I'm cowardly, courage of the cowardly dog or whatever else, or I'm constantly afraid of something, then what I need to do is I need to probably go see if there are people out there who have the virtue of courage that I think I want to develop. Because again, it's empirical. Go out into your community and see if there are people who have this. If not, maybe you can think of something like a really great character. So Jean-Luc Picard from Star Trek, he's one of my favorite characters. Maybe he's someone that I want to model my life after in certain ways, right? And initially, whenever I'm trying to do the good thing, it's not going to feel right. I'm still going to feel a little bit cowardly, but I'm going to force myself to become better. And eventually, just like the lyre player, the person who learns the guitar, after more and more exercises, it becomes a little bit more natural. And soon enough, I'm not only doing the right thing, I'm also doing the right thing with the right mindset. And I eventually develop a sort of naturalness to my actions. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm not reflective. I can always give an account and I can always tweak what's going on. But it does mean, just like habits, right? This is why sometimes people conflate virtues with habits. They're much more than habits. But it's a subtle process that takes a lot of time. And you can see this in lots of other things. So pleasure, this is a good example. If you constantly are letting pleasure rule your life, you're likely indulgent. Okay? If you never experience pleasure, Aristotle also didn't like this. He thought that you were ascetic. You happen to be the type of animal who can experience pleasure and pain. And you should experience appropriate pleasures and appropriate pains. So on the pleasure side, it doesn't make sense to deny yourself all pleasures. You should indulge from time to time. Okay? That's what it means to be moderate. How do you know when something is becoming immoderate? Well, it's affecting your ability to live well. And whenever you face that emotion or that sphere in life, it basically takes you over. You have no chance of turning it down. So take someone who's maybe like an alcoholic or something like that, right? What makes that a bad thing is it can wreck careers, it can wreck family, etc. That's why it's not good. And one of the ways that you can tell is if you offer an alcoholic a drink, they're never going to turn it down, right? Same sort of thing with being indulgent, self-indulgent, or immoderate. Some of these spheres can start to take over our lives and influence everything else. We want to be happy, right? Again, that's the goal. So we need to develop in ourselves the character that allows us to achieve that. It's really, really tough to lead a full, flourishing human life if pleasures completely control us, or if we're afraid all of the time. And the last one that I'll just kind of talk about is having excess money, and he has a lot more examples. These are just the ones that I'm going to bring up. But someone who has more than they need, if they never give any of that away, then they're often stingy, okay? But if they give away too much, then they're a spendthrift. They're too open-handed in a certain way. The generous person is someone who's in the middle again. So they will give away whenever they're in a position to give away and whenever it doesn't, put them in a bad situation. But, they've learned the lessons from trying to keep everything to themselves and just giving it away way too often. So the virtues, they relate to emotions or spheres of life. We all face fear. We all face pleasure and pain. We all, at some point in our life, will have more than we need. And so what the virtues try and get us to reflect on is there a way for me to relate to this fear in an excessive or a deficient way? What are the wrong options? How can I aim between those wrong options to get at the right thing? And it's not just doing the right thing once, right? It's doing the right thing over time such that you develop your character. So I want to also stress the holistic psychological thing, because this is really, really important. especially whenever we get to the utilitarians and whenever we get to the Kantians, because they are going to be very, very reason heavy. Aristotle is still reason heavy in the sense that reason is running the game, but the emotions and the motivations have to be right too. So take the example of giving money to a homeless person because they're selling magazines or something like that. I haven't seen it happen too much in Louisville, but in Nashville, the homeless people there have a newspaper and they sell them on the streets, right? And so maybe you buy one of these newspapers, typically $2. Sometimes they're $1, sometimes they're $5, whatever else it is. The $5, let's say, it's not going to break you, right? And you have the cash, you don't need it. And so you see this person, and it would be generous to give that money to the homeless person. Okay? So you do it. And Aristotle is going to say, without a doubt, that's a good thing. But it may or may not be virtuous depending on what you were feeling. If you felt conflicted about it, if you felt resentful toward them, if you felt angry about them, if you blamed them for their situation, even though you don't really know their story or what's going on, that's something you need to work on. If you hand them the money and say, hey, thanks for the paper, I hope you have a good one, that's a great way of executing that action. If you just throw the money at them or just say, why don't you get a real job or whatever, they're still getting the money, right? But it's not the right way of doing that thing. Virtue ethics stresses you have to have your emotions right and you have to do things in a good manner of execution. This is why, for example, someone who's very wealthy and gives money to charity for the tax break, they're doing something right. Okay, they're doing something good because people will benefit from that donation. However, it isn't completely virtuous because maybe they secretly resent the poor, or maybe they don't care about the poor at all and they're just doing it for the tax break. So this is what's kind of interesting about Aristotelian virtue ethics, in that it's not just action-based, it's character-based. It's about who you are. It's about your entire life lived well. So you have these more holistic concerns. It is not microscopic, focusing only on actions. That's kind of what the utilitarians and the Kantians are going to do. Rather, instead of asking what a person should do in a particular situation, the more important questions are, what is a good life? What kind of, person is that person? And how can we get those things to kind of work together? And given that they want to be happy, and given that they want to be virtuous, now can we kind of figure out what they should do? And it's going to be different, like I said, depending on different people. So obviously we aren't face-to-face this semester. I'm kind of short, but other than that, I'm a fairly rough-looking guy, right? I have a long beard, pretty stocky, aka a little thick, right? People don't generally give me crap, right? So if anything, whenever I'm in, so I was like a waiter once, if I'm waiting tables or if I'm in front of the classroom, I have to be a little nicer, I guess, or a little more fluid. I don't have to flex on my authority because people are not typically going to challenge that with me. I have friends. So when I was waiting tables or in academia, some of my friends who have PhDs, they were sort of petite, really beautiful women. Really, really intelligent, really incredibly great scholars. They had, my utmost respect and still do. But sometimes with customers and with teachers, with customers and with students and stuff like that, they had to be much more authoritative and stern because students or customers would challenge their authority or try to objectify them in certain ways. I don't have to deal with that, right? And so that's why the particularism for Aristotle matters. It matters our embodiment, what issues we are facing, and it matters kind of what society we're in. Now, that's not unique to American society, but it might not be as big a problem in other areas, right? And so we need to know the details. And all of this is just to say, with virtue ethics, you have the two questions that are super, super important. What is a good, meaningful, or a happy life? How do I develop myself in order to accomplish that? Right? So the anchor is, how do I live a good life? And then the means is, how do I change my character traits, my dispositions, my habits in order to achieve that good life? That's what virtue ethics is all about. But it's really, really important for me to stress this next thing. Okay. So the first two things, if you can remember, question number one, what is a good life? Question number two, what are the virtues and vices? The virtues help me to achieve it. The vices take me further away from it. What makes Aristotle's view, I guess, unique is that he also includes something like moral luck. And what I mean by moral luck is something that's outside of your control. Can't control anything about it, but it nonetheless affects your moral or your ethical quality of life. So some examples would be something like health, wealth, beauty, justice. We can't control our health. I mean, I can eat well, I can exercise and stuff like that, but I can't control my genetics. I can't control whether or not I fall prey to some sort of illness. That's just outside of my control. But Aristotle is going to say, nonetheless, whenever you look at the lives that we think are the happiest, it's not going to include people who are in constant debilitating pain every single day. We just don't think that that's a good life. Wealth. You don't have to be super rich, but if you're constantly stressed about which utility is going to get shut off or how you're going to pay rent or whatever else, that's going to make it really hard to live a good life. So it's about probabilities. Again, it's not closing anything off in principle. That's not what Aristotle is saying. He's saying, look at all of the people who are living what you think are good lives, find the things that are in common to them, and you're going to find some of these things that are outside of their control. Beauty. Beauty is a really weird one, but they've done studies about CEOs. They tend to be over 6 feet tall, right? And it's not because tall people are more intelligent than short people. I'm 5'5", 5'6", you know? That's like obviously influences dating. You know, there's the people on Tinder who say 6 feet or over, that's what they want. These things don't mean that I can't flourish. It just means that it might be more difficult for me in certain ways. Justice. If you live in a society that is oppressive and that doesn't treat you with respect and that doesn't allow you to have jobs or certain careers or things like that, that's also going to influence whether you can live a good life. Because again, it's not just about self-development. It's about being integrated into your community. It's about doing all of these things that we think are characteristic of a complete life. A complete life. Aristotle sometimes describes eudaimonia as the complete life that's missing nothing. Maybe you could have more money, maybe you could have one extra friend or whatever else, but it's not really missing anything. And sometimes this boils down to things that are outside of our control. So I want to take like a couple of seconds, and I don't have this in the slides, but to talk about friendship. Friendship is exactly one of these things. We can't control who likes us. Moreover, we can't control who the people are who are around us. Sometimes we get lucky by having good people around us. Sometimes we get unlucky by having bad people around us. But Aristotle says, friends and friendship are one of the most crucial things in life. And he makes kind of a bet to the reader, not in this language, but basically says, you know, imagine that there are two lives. In one life, you are incredibly, incredibly wealthy. You have a great reputation. You're healthy. You have everything that you need, but you have no close friends. In the other life, you know, you're not rich. You have enough money. You're not the most attractive, but you're all right. You know, you have an okay reputation, but not many people know you. But you have one or two really close friends. Aristotle says we're going to choose that second life every single time. And that's because friendship is just so crucially important to us and to our lives. Why? It's really, really difficult to become a good person. And friends help us with that. And this is why he talks about the 3 different types of friendship. He talks about the friends of use and the friends of pleasure. Those are plentiful, really easy to make, really easy to lose. Friends of use are people who help you out. Think like your work colleagues. They're people you might add on LinkedIn. They're people who can help you to do certain things. But the friendship really doesn't last if that person doesn't help you fulfill that use. They're not bad, right? But they're only good insofar as they help you with that use. Same thing with pleasure. These are your friends who you like to go out and party with. I mean, I don't know what social media, maybe Snapchat or whatever. They're fun. But if, for example, they really like to go out and drink, and suddenly you decide that you don't want to drink anymore, or you don't have money for drinking, the friendship kind of goes away because the pleasure, the way that you used to enjoy yourselves, isn't there anymore, right? So friendships of pleasure, again, they aren't bad, right? It's a lot of fun to have friends that you turn up with. You can go out to the club, you can do whatever else. In my case, that I can play Fall Guys or whatever else that I want to do, play music, etc., right? Friendships of pleasure are really great. But he says, what's the most important for us are friendships of virtue. And that's because friends of virtue, the excellent friends, we share the same types of moral values. We kind of are in the same mindset, in lockstep, whenever we're deciding what kind of good life we want to lead, what kind of people we want to be. They become other selves. This is something that he says, other selves. And what's interesting about other selves is that whenever we see our friends struggling with something, we can point stuff out to them, right? It's hard to be a good friend because that often entails having to have really awkward conversations with your friends whenever they're messing up. I don't think that you dating so-and-so is the best for you. Now, I'm still going to love you and I'm still going to be there for you. I just want you to know that I'm not real sure about this. Sometimes you have to say stuff like that. Or, hey, I think that you've been drinking too much. Whenever you drink a lot, you black out and you do stuff that you just start acting in a way that I don't think is really you. And I think we need to find a way to cut it back or maybe get you some help. Those are the kinds of things that you have to tell friends. And it's hard to develop that rapport. But what friends can sometimes do is they can help us to see things that we do not so easily see ourselves. They have an outside perspective. They can sometimes know us better than we know ourselves. That's why friends of virtue are so, so important. The other thing is, whenever we see a really good friend, and again, they have similar values to us, we can observe them easier than we can observe ourselves. But because they share values with us, it's like we get to observe someone with our values and seeing how their life goes. So again, the friends of virtue, they help us to figure out how to live life, what virtues and vices we should and shouldn't develop, what things we should strive after in life. And just, certain things are hard to do. Certain things are hard to do just one person all by themselves. So we need other people to rely on. That's moral luck. It's completely outside of our control, right? But Aristotle nonetheless says, if you do not have friends, you are not happy. You're not eudaimon. And so that's something that we really need to stress here because it's going to differ from the next couple of moral theories. What comes out of this with Aristotle is a view that happiness is fragile. This is Martha Nussbaum. She calls it the fragility of goodness. Our happiness, no matter how good we are, no matter how disciplined we are, no matter us doing the right thing all the time, it can still be destroyed. We can get some sort of debilitating and painful illness that completely destroys our lives. So some people think this about, say, something like Alzheimer's, right? This is what makes it a really, really tough disease, and that it starts to take away all of your mental faculties. Okay? Probabilistically, again, nothing for certain. This is why it's tough to be really, really poor and really be happy. Because if you have to work a double, say, like some of my family members, maybe you a custodian at the elementary school, and then you work at the diner, in the graveyard shift, just so that you can help your kids afford a little bit of, lunch money or whatever else it is, that's going to be a really tough life. We don't control a lot of this stuff. Nonetheless, we think that it constitutes part of our happiness. So that's Aristotle, right? What is happiness? Happiness is a long-term accomplishment of an entire life lived well. It is a complete life that's missing nothing. It is a life according to reason and virtue. That's what we're aiming for. We all want that. How do we get that? We get that by ordering ourselves to be able to face the situations and emotions that all humans face and face them well. We develop the virtues. The virtues tend to be the mean between the extremes. Not too much, not too little. And we have to practice at them, not just to do the right thing, but to reliably do the right thing to where it feels natural, to feel good about doing good things and bad about doing bad things. When you mess up, you go and apologize, and to be reliably motivated. any situation in life that calls for that virtue, you're going to be able to do that thing, right? That's Aristotle. And happiness isn't just self-development. It's also hoping to have, good enough luck with your health and your wealth and beauty and justice and all sorts of stuff that we sort of see are common to all of the happy lives that we think are happening in our communities. Again, not abstract, not abstract. You should be able to go out into your community and see examples of lives that you would want to live, try and find those features to define happiness, and you should be able to see what kind of character, what kind of person they are, so that you can emulate that. That's what's really important here. Let's compare this. The next person I'm going to compare it to is Epicurus, because I think the Epicureans are kind of a little bit of a middle ground between the Aristotelians and the Stoics, who we're going to get later. And I really think that this quote hits the nail on the head as far as Epicurus, and it comes from the letter to Menoetius, right? And here it is. Therefore, becoming accustomed to simple, not extravagant ways of life makes one completely healthy, makes man unhesitant in the face of life's necessary duties, puts us in better condition of the times of extravagance which occasionally come along, and makes us fearless in the face of chance. So Epicurus is basically going to say, what we want to do is have as much pleasure in our lives as possible. Pleasure is the good. And how do we do that? We do that by living a life that's as simple as possible, because it gets rid of pain and anxiety, and it helps us to appreciate what we have. So Epicurus kind of changes, he shifts it from eudaimonia, the Greek just happiness, and he gives us a more specific word, which is ataraxia. And ataraxia is basically unperturbedness, not being disturbed, aka tranquility. So it's kind of like, you go along and things can they can hit you or whatever, but you're going to be able to recover and you're going to kind of like keep that even keel. That's what we want. And this is also what the Stoics are going to want. It's going to be a different method as far as how you get it, but that's what we're striving for. Not this big, grand thing that Aristotle is talking about with all of these moving parts. It is ataraxia, tranquility. The good, without a doubt, for the Epicureans is pleasure. So Aristotle, again, pleasure is a part. That's why you need moderation. But you need friends, you need justice, you need all sorts of other things, right? You need a lot of things to go right. For the Epicureans, it's just the idea that pleasure is the good. How do we make sure that we get as much of pleasure as possible? Well, the first thing is we need to study the world and philosophy to help to do three things. So the Epicureans were scientists, right? They were philosophers. They had a very deep theory of materialism. Everything is made out of matter. And they had an atomic theory. Basically, the world is composed of these bits that you cannot cut apart, very simple elements. So they had all of these natural things to point out the natural order of the universe. Because if you can approach life logically and see the way the world actually works, this is what can help you to live tranquilly. And in particular, here's a couple of things that you need to do in order to achieve this Epicurean ideal of life. One is try to avoid bodily pains. Okay? So one thing that you can do is just avoid pain. If you want to maximize pleasure, avoid pain. So exercise, eat right, walk around, get some fresh air, that kind of stuff. If you avoid the bodily pains, that can make your life go a little bit better. And if you think about whenever you're ill or uncomfortable or whatever else, there's a way in which whenever you're in pain, it can deeply impact how you're living your life. Try to avoid that. So that's step number one. Step number two is avoiding anxieties. Okay? So it's not just about bodily pains, it's also about psychological pains. And this is why in the Epicureans, so especially in Lucretius, you'll see a ton of arguments about death and about the gods. because people in the Greco-Roman world were really they were really worried about those two things. Are the gods really unjust and crazy like they are in the Homeric poems, right? Is Zeus going around basically raping women? Are the gods really vindictive and killing mortals? Those are not people that you want to be under the control of. And so the Epicureans spent a lot of time saying, no, that's not the case at all. Whenever you look at the universe, there's this deep order, and this is kind of what's going on. And if there is this God, it's kind of like this impersonal power. And that tried to help people to get rid of their anxieties. Hopefully, they weren't afraid of these vindictive gods anymore. Additionally, people are afraid of dying. And so the Epicureans, they tried to make lots of arguments. So one argument that they made that you shouldn't fear death is, look, why do you fear death? Why do you fear death? Because after you die, you don't exist anymore. There's no you, right? Do you fear, they ask, the time before you were alive, before you were born? No, right? No, because you weren't around. It's just not relevant. It's the same sort of thing that happens when you die. So in the same way that you shouldn't fear the life before you existed, you definitely shouldn't fear what happens after you die. So they tried to offer types of arguments that help people to get rid of their anxieties. And this is why you study science and philosophy and all that kind of stuff, to try and cut through all of the noise and get to the core ideas that can help you to get rid of your anxieties. And then the last thing is enjoying the simple pleasures. So he talks about in the letter, barley cakes and water. He says, those who, often have extravagance are the people who least need it. Basically, he's saying the people who live these really big, fancy lives, they have, the fancy cars, they have the most delicious and decadent meals, they don't need it. And the only reason really that they need such extravagance is because they aren't hungry, they aren't thirsty, they have all of their needs met. It's only because they need excess to feel that they need all of that extravagance. That's exactly what we don't want to do. Because if you're hungry, barley cakes are going to taste really good. If you're thirsty, water is going to be incredibly, incredibly delicious to you, right? And they're going to say the same thing about romantic relationships. Rather than give up your virtue, because you want to maintain the tranquility, right? You want to keep your head about you. Make good friends and masturbate. Because romance very often can cloud your vision and it can make you behave foolishly, or maybe you end up in a bad relationship and it just takes up a lot of aspects of your life that you don't think it should do. Get rid of it. Enjoy the simple pleasures. Barley cakes, water, friends, right? And so what comes out of this view, I think, is this kind of moderate philosophy. Aristotelian virtue ethics is very complicated, right? The Epicureans simplify. Maybe we don't need all of that stuff that Aristotle says. Maybe the good isn't complete and total holistic psychological development, an entire life lived well, all of these goods, justice, etc., right? It turns out that the good is pleasure. And the way that we make sure that we experience the most pleasure in life is to avoid bodily pains, avoid psychological anxieties, and to really enjoy the simple pleasures. Because guess what? The simple pleasures, the natural pleasures, they're going to say, are the easiest to secure. And so I'm Hispanic, right? Beans and tortillas, man. They don't cost anything. And if I can be satisfied with beans and tortillas, I often make them, every couple of weeks. It's a huge, huge thing. But if I'm the kind of person who only can eat, braised pork belly or, organic kale chips or something like that, I don't know, right? Those are incredible good things, and I totally will eat them any chance that I get. Just like the Epicureans are going to say. If you have an opportunity to eat a really fancy buffet, go for it. If someone really attractive to you really wants to sleep with you and you can maintain your health, go for it. right? It's not that you can't indulge in pleasure. Pleasure is really fantastic. But it's that if you pursue these unnatural or these really complicated, luxurious pleasures, it's really hard to get them, and you end up giving an aspect of your tranquility away just to pursue those. And that's what's really, really important about them. So he kind of agrees with Aristotle. We do need things that are outside of our control, simple pleasures, right? But it turns out that the simple ones are really, really easy to secure. It's not as fragile as Aristotle. Let's look at the third view now. And this is Epictetus. He was a Stoic. And what's interesting about Stoicism is you have literal slaves. Epictetus was a slave. He educated people. He was, taught to read and write for this purpose. He was also disabled. It's not, clear exactly because the ancient sources are word of mouth, basically. But he had either, a broken leg or a broken arm. Sometimes said because his slave master broke it for him to kind of test whether he was actually, Stoic and could just go along with things. And then you also have emperors like Marcus Aurelius, who I'm going to end with the Stoicism section. But Epictetus, we read sections from the handbook. It's a really, really short thing. He wrote a really long work called the Discourses. But the handbook is basically a selection of aphorisms, really short paragraphs, Stoic exercises to help you to live well. And the core of the Stoic message, I think, is captured in this one, which is in his handbook. I think it's saying number 8. Do not seek to have events happen as you want them to, but instead, want them to happen as they do happen, and your life will go well. So this is that Stoic mentality, the mentality that says, look, you can't control a lot in life, but you can control your mindset. You can control your reactions. And so rather than wanting to control everything in life, or really anything in life, only try to control your mindset. And if you can do that, if you can control your reactions, you will be able to live a good life. One of my good friends, Tom Holliday, from when I was in grad school, he described Stoicism as the theory of how not to be destroyed by the world. Newsflash. Living is really, really tough, right? It has a lot of suffering. We have to make really tough decisions. There's not very many certainties. Stoicism says, that's right. But within all of the chaos, you have one immense strength, and that is your ability to be able to control your mind. So do that. Do that. And if you do that, you are living as well as morally or ethically possible. And that's what's most important. So again, Epictetus here is talking about ataraxia, tranquility or unperturbedness. And he has a few different things that he recommends. And I'm going to boil it down to 3 different themes. The first one, and this is kind of like the Epicureans, and this is because, all of these schools are kind of talking with each other and fighting with each other. They all have their own gyms or schools, right? Aristotle has the Lyceum. The Stoics were kind of hanging out on porches. The Epicureans had a place called the Garden. So they're all kind of talking with each other. They're all arguing about what a good life is and what they should do. But they agree you should try to distinguish appearances from reality. And I say thinking jugs, because there's 2 things and 2 sayings that I hope you read and that you really picked up on. The first one is the first saying. And this is where Epictetus offers the grand divide, the grand division. There's 2 types of things in life, the things you can control and the things you can't. The things you can control are by nature free and unhindered. And those are your thoughts, your feelings, your desires, so the things that you want and you don't want, and your values. That's where you are freest, because you can control everything about that, your basic psychology. That's what you need to focus on. Everything else, it's not up to you. It's hindered. It's really tough. Don't place your happiness there, because if you do, you will be dismantled by living mortal existence, right? And the stuff that's not up to us is our health. So he doesn't even think our bodies are up to us. Makes sense, like I said. Epictetus was He had the broken leg or the broken arm, depending on what's going on. Medicine wasn't great in the ancient world, right? He was probably in a considerable amount of pain. So your health isn't up to you. Your reputation, the political climate that you're in, none of that is up to you. So he says, let go of that. Let go of that. Why? You can't control any of that. If you have to be tranquil or happy whenever you're in a perfectly just society, the Stoics are going to say, yeah, good luck with that. Good luck with that, because no perfectly just society has ever existed. And if that's where you place your happiness, you aren't going to be very happy, right? So only place your happiness in the things that you can control, your mindset. That's where the thinking is. The Jugs comes in whenever he says, try to look at the nature of things and realize what they are. If you are fond of a jug, or a really fantastic piece of pottery, or a cell phone, right? Great. Enjoy that. But also realize that that thing is just a thing and things break. So if you're a fan of your jug, great, but jugs break. And if you tell yourself that, if you remind yourself of what the reality of that situation is, whenever that jug inevitably breaks, you are not going to be shocked and you're not going to be destroyed. You might be sad. That's okay. It's normal to have those reactions, but you're going to be able to pick yourself up fairly quickly because you have been telling yourself that that thing is a thing that breaks. Similarly, if you have a spouse or a child, then you should really love them and really appreciate your time with them, but you should also look at them and tell yourself, don't tell them this because it's weird, that person is going to die someday. Right? So sometimes when I'm petting my dog, I do my Stoic exercises. I'm like, oh, Lala, I love you. You're such a wonderful girl. Someday you're going to die, and that's going to make me really sad, but I'm really glad that I have my time with you. And so that's a little weird, but she's a dog. She can't understand English. I don't tell her in German because she doesn't understand German. She's, strange dog. Listened to a lot of Rammstein when she was in her teenage years. But the idea there is realize what things are, because things are impermanent. They break. And you need to make sure that your basis, your foundation, is not in something that you can't control. People don't like this. They think it's really heartless. Whenever they read that saying in the handbook, they're like, what is he talking about? This is really, really awful. But I think that the Stoics are trying to say, cut through all of the BS. There's a lot of noise out there. What you need to do is see things for what they are. Because if you do that, you will be able to severely enhance your own abilities and get rid of the stuff that used to hold sway over you. By the way, this is also the same kind of insight that people who have like a serious illness or like some sort of life-changing experience, they kind of talk like this too. So the Stoics often are used in self-help, and they also are used in certain types of therapy, right? So you'll see them kind of all over the place, but there's a basis for it. Second thing, align your desires with reality. And what I mean by that, and he gives a couple of different things. So I've said the cost of action or all things forgotten. He has this saying where he's talking about, if you want to be an Olympian, so let's say that you want to be a champion wrestler. Think about that, okay? Think about that. If you legitimately want to do that, and I'm going to change the example to like strongman, which is something I'm a little more familiar with, or powerlifting, because I did that when I was in high school. If you want to be a champion powerlifter, what are you going to have to do? All right, you're going to have to work out at least a couple of hours most days of the week on weight training, maybe a couple more with cardio and stuff like that. In addition, you're going to have to eat a lot of food. Maybe you eat clean, maybe you don't, but you're probably going to eat 6,000 to 10,000 calories per day. That's a lot of food. And if you're trying to compete with certain types of leagues, you're probably going to need sports supplement. And because you're training really hard, you're probably going to need like physical therapy and stuff like that. So you just start to say, if my goal is to be a champion powerlifter, then I need to look at all of the things that come along with that. Now, he doesn't tell you not to do that, but he says, try to figure that out. Because whenever people often are trying to do great things or set goals for themselves, what they don't do is look at what it actually takes to do that. Same sort of thing with like, being a rapper or any number of things, being a good dancer. all the rehearsal time, all of the time studying under teachers, all of the time spent in auditions and practicing, all of the types of things that you have to do, being around really stuffy, pretentious people, trying to find a good break. Whenever you get a record deal, doing what the record label kind of says. So you sort of have your radio songs and then you have your own songs, or maybe you do the popular stuff for the record label and release mixtapes on the side if your contract allows that, right? But the idea is think about everything that goes into an action and adjust your life accordingly, because the happiness consists in our thoughts, our emotions, our desires, and our values. And if we desire things that are hard to control or are outside of our control, we are potentially going to be incredibly, incredibly miserable. So he's going to warn against that. And then the other thing is, it's all going to be forgotten anyway, right? So we kind of remember Epictetus, but what do we remember about him? We remember a few things that are told in things. Some of you probably have never even heard of him before this class, right? Try and imagine the life of a United States president who isn't George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or one who's been alive in the last 50 years. Those people presumably made really important contributions to American life. How much do you remember about them? Next to nothing, myself included, right? That, again, is one of the things. Remember your desires, because some things you desire and you don't realize all the work that's going to go into it. It's fine if you want to do that, but realize that it takes a lot of work. So if you fail, you know why you failed. Moreover, be honest with yourself. If you're really vainglorious and you're doing this for reputation and you're doing this because you're afraid of dying, etc., you're not dealing with the underlying issues. So align your desires with reality. And just like the Epicureans, although in a different way, the Stoics made tons of advances in logic, and they studied the world, and they saw that there was a very deep order. There was a very deep order. So Epictetus says, want things to be as they are, not as you want them to be. In order to buy into that, you have to kind of buy into this idea of fate. The world, if you are a Stoic and you look at the world and you see the world as inherently ordered, and you see it as doing things that make sense on a cosmic scale, it's much easier to surrender yourself to that. Because if you look at the world and you do not see that, it's not going to be feasible to you or desirable to you to just kind of let what happens. And so that's this last part, which is play your part well. Epictetus was a slave, as I said. Marcus Aurelius is an emperor. And he has a saying where he talks about, coming on stage and playing your part, because theater was a big part of Greek society, Greek and Roman society. It doesn't matter what part you have. Not all of us have the lead part. I'm not all that important of a person, right? I get to teach and I love my job, but I also don't have any grandeur illusions about becoming president or whatever else. Not going to happen. So he's going to say, rather than resent yourself or think that you're above certain things, or rather than strive for things that are basically outside of your reach, be really, really careful and just try to be satisfied with the part that you have. Not all of us are the lead part in Romeo and Juliet. Some of us, not that maybe that's not a play that, we would want to be the lead part in, but, maybe some of us are the trees on the side, doing our little jazz hands and our tree costumes or whatever. That's all right. It's all right. The world is deeply ordered. It's logical. There's a reason to it. We have a particular sort of good fate. So play that part well. Be the best tree you can be, right? And so again, this is something where the fatalism aspect that comes out in the Stoicism. You have to be okay with the world being as it is. So before I move on to Marcus Aurelius, I want to spend a couple of minutes just kind of talking about this is also something that's really, really important as far as justice and oppression. So Aristotle, his view of happiness is incredibly fragile. But because you're trying to ensure that you can flourish, and in the political works that as many people in your society can flourish all the time, and because your happiness is broken if you live in an oppressive society, you have motivation to do the right thing. You have motivation to try to change your society because you can't live a good life if your society is not a good one, right? Now, on the one hand, that makes it fragile. If you are born in an unjust society, you can't flourish. But on the other hand, he's going to say, that makes perfect sense. Do something about it. And the same sort of thing with like grieving or whatever else. If one of your good friends dies, Aristotle's going to say, yeah, your emotions matter. It's completely okay for you to feel upset about that. Or if you see some sort of slight, someone uses a racial slur or does something really stupid in public, it's okay for you to feel angry because that anger is responding to some sort of injustice or bad thing that's happening out there. Now, are those emotions pleasant? No. Is it good that everything is fragile? I don't think he thinks it is. But that's just how it is according to Aristotle. The Stoics, however, are going to say, don't do that. Don't do that, right? Maybe you can strive for justice on your free time, but don't place your happiness there because you are going to be miserable because no world is going to be perfect. Don't place your happiness in your friends because they're going to die or they're going to disappoint you or whatever else. Can you enjoy your time with them? Sure. But don't place your happiness there, not in a deep sense, because you can't control it and you will be destroyed. And that's just sort of a tough decision that you kind of have to make with these moral theories. The Aristotelians are going to say, look, human life is just fragile. Sometimes it's tragic. And I would much rather be destroyed in certain ways because I think that's what life sometimes includes. Now I'm going to do everything that I can not to do that. And they're going to say, look, I agree with you, Stoics. I need self-discipline. I need to cultivate my psychology in a lot of ways. But I don't think that happiness can be reduced to just your inner psychology. I'm sorry. The Stoics are going to say, that's really foolish. It's very imprudent. It's not the practical thing to do. They're going to say, yeah, you're never going to be able to reform society perfectly. People are going to disappoint you. You need to make sure that your source of happiness is completely within you. And they're going to say, look, if that means that I'm a little reserved, if that means that I come off as cold at some time, if that means that just like people think that I'm a little strange, so be it. I don't care about them anyway. All I care about is myself. But I'm going to be tranquil, and whenever the world goes, to chaos, I'm going to be able to get through it. I don't know. I don't know if you find that appealing, but that's kind of the debate about what's going on. I wanted to share Marcus Aurelius because there's kind of a debate in ancient philosophy, which is one of my favorite areas, between the Aristotelians and the Stoics, as I've kind of like set up, right? And it is, what do you do with these things like pleasure or friendship or justice or whatever else? And the Stoics have this term called preferred indifference. So they're going to say stuff like friendship or health or justice, that's not where your happiness is, right? So it doesn't influence the ethical quality of your life. It doesn't make you happy or unhappy. Your happiness or unhappiness depends only on your psychology, right? But all things being equal, we'd kind of prefer living in a just society as opposed to an unjust society. So you have some of these softer Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca and Cicero, depending on where you want to place them, that try to, I think, make a little bit of concession and bring the two camps closer together. And I really like this following quote. It's going to be a wall of text because in it, Marcus Aurelius is talking to himself. And again, he's an emperor. So he's got a ton of people trying to be in his good graces. He has a ton of people who hate him. He has a lot of power. He has a ton of weighty decisions that he constantly has to make. And the meditations are just his journal to himself. He didn't mean for this to be published. These are the things that he's trying to tell himself because he had philosophical training to try and be a better person. And ultimately, he was arguably one of the last great Roman emperors, right? So he has this conversation with himself. Remember, Emperor of Rome. This is what he decides to write in his journal. Soon you'll be ashes or bones, a mere name at most, and even that is just a sound, an echo. The things we want in life are empty, stale, trivial. Dogs snarling at each other, quarreling children, laughing and then bursting into tears a moment later. Trust, shame, justice, truth, gone from the earth and only found in heaven. Why are you still here? Sensory objects are shifting and unstable, our senses dim and easily deceived, soul itself a decoction of blood. Fame in a world like this is worthless. I love it. I mean, I just love how poetic it is. I love that this is what he's telling himself. The Emperor of Rome, you'll just be a name. That's an echo. They aren't going to know you, Marcus. They aren't going to know what your favorite foods are. They aren't going to know what your tells are whenever you're having a bad day. They're not going to know how happy you were whenever your children were born. You know, they're not going to know anything about you. Keep everything in perspective. You, Emperor, you will be ashes and bones someday. Right? Everything is temporary. Everything has problems. What are you doing? What are you doing? And this is why the Stoics are saying, don't place your happiness in any of that. Place your happiness in your mindset. And so the gray sort of highlights here are an imaginary critic. So the critic says, and so? He replies, wait for it patiently. Annihilation or metamorphosis. The critic says, and until that comes what? He replies, honor and revere the gods. Treat human beings as they deserve to be treated. Be tolerant with others and strict with yourself. Remember, nothing belongs to you but your flesh and blood, and nothing else is under your control. This is Marcus Aurelius. The Gregory Hayes translation, by the way, I think this book is like $10 on Amazon. This is so good. This is so good. I recommend that translation. It's not as strict as others, but it's poetic and it's beautiful. But this is Marcus Aurelius' advice for himself. And I there's just so much that I love about this quote. Annihilation or metamorphosis. Notice, not giving up. Not giving up. I'm going to keep doing what's right, controlling myself and changing what I can, but not placing my happiness there until either I die or until things change. That's it. No giving up there. There's no surrender in Marcus. Annihilation or metamorphosis. And despite the fact that he can't control other people, that he can't control justice, etc., he says, nonetheless, I'm going to honor and revere the gods. I'm going to treat people with dignity. I'm going to be tolerant of others and strict with myself. There's this sort of gentle power to Marcus Aurelius that I really love. And I think that you see it in people who are grounded in areas that are fairly strong. We saw this in Dave Foster Wallace's This Is Water speech. Why do you choose potentially to worship something like Jesus or, Allah or the Four Noble Truths or whatever else it is? It's because this world is very, very harsh. And if you pick the wrong things, Aristotle says this in book 1 as well, you will be eaten alive. You will die a miserable death. And this is kind of Aristotle's point. This is why we're trying to pay attention to what a good life is or what kind of person we should be, because if we choose the wrong things, we run the risk of leading a miserable life. And maybe we don't want that, right? And what a lot of this stuff is trying to get us to do is to reflect on what is good in life. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Priam, because I know this was part of the reflection, but here is something, and these are, some lines from the Iliad by Homer. And Priam was the king of Troy, and the Greek warriors and kings went to Troy to steal back Helen. Helen, of course, has been kidnapped by one of Priam's sons. Priam has 2 sons of note. Paris, who's the screw-up, and he kidnaps Helen because she's beautiful. And Hector, who's the good son. He's incredibly wise and courageous and a great warrior, and will be a great heir to Priam, who is also good. Throughout the drama of the battle, eventually Achilles kills Hector. And the Greeks and the Trojans, a lot of the ancient cultures have very strict burial rites. They want the corpse to be returned in a certain condition so that they can observe it and have a funeral and have a time of mourning, right? Achilles instead drags Hector's body behind his chariot and refuses to give the corpse back. So Priam, He's led this really incredible life. And one of his screw up sons, nothing he controlled, right? Kidnaps a woman, a queen, basically, and brings war to his footstep that kills his good son. So Priam is torn up about this. And he's guided to Achilles' camp, I think, by Hermes, and the messenger god. And he decides that he's going to beg Achilles, the man who killed his good son. He's going to beg him for Hector's corpse so that they can have, a proper grieving. And so this is a very famous line, and I cut out some lines in between these. But Priam says to Achilles, "I have endured what no man on earth has done before. I put my lips on the hands of the man who killed my son." So Priam goes into Achilles' tent and is begging him, basically, right? And it's not just begging him. He realizes that those same hands that he's kissing now, begging, are the hands that slew his son and disrespected his corpse. And Achilles, he kind of says to him, "And you too, old man, we hear you prospered once." And he goes into details about how big his kingdom was. That entire realm, they say, you lorded over once. You excelled all men, old king, in sons and wealth, right? So you, not only did you have a big kingdom, but you were better than everyone else. You had a lot of money. You had great heirs. Things were going really, really good for you. But then the gods of heaven brought this agony on you. Ceaseless battles round your walls, your armies slaughtered. And so it goes on, right? But Achilles is basically saying, and now everything is really messed up. He talks about how Zeus has a couple of different jars, one full of blessings and one full of curses, right? And it seems like the jar of curses is just being emptied on Priam right now. His kingdom is falling. A lot of his soldiers have been killed. His good son, the rightful heir, it looked like he was going to ensure the success of Troy. He gets slaughtered. Achilles notices this. Eventually, Achilles lets Priam take the body back, right? They observe some funerary time. Achilles even weeps with Priam in the Iliad. This is something that isn't often talked about because Achilles thinks about his own dead father, and then depending on the tradition, his dead lover and or dead cousin. It's not sure what's going on, right? But we know how the battle at Troy ends. It ends with the Greeks building the wooden sculpture that they sneak inside because no one can get into the walls of Troy. The walls of Troy are super well fortified. They're inside this sculpture. The Trojans bring it inside. The Greeks get out and they completely ransack Troy. They kill people. They rape people. They're doing really awful things. And this is an old Greek vase, and I wanted to put this up. So the blue circle is around, oh man, I'm forgetting the name of the person who traditionally killed Priam. Anyway, a Greek warrior who kills Priam. I believe, no, I'm not going to speculate about that. But in this particular depiction, what Priam is being beat to death with is Hector's son. So that's a baby being used to beat Priam to death. Okay? And that's a really grisly thought. It's a terrible image, but I think it basically encapsulates this whole image of Priam, right? Lived a really, really great life for most of his life, but then at the very end, it was very, very bad. So why do I bring up this particular example? It's because it's one that Aristotle mentions a couple of times in the Nicomachean Ethics. And he says, this is why we think that happiness is a lifelong sort of thing. And he says, maybe we don't even judge whether someone is happy until after they've died, because we need to know the scope of their life, right? Because if we look at someone, for example, who's being tortured, or if we look at someone like Priam, we do not want to live that life, and we do not want to call him happy. Sure, he had a kingdom. Sure, he had wealth and great family and all of that. But the way his life ended completely marred everything that happened before, and that is not a life that we would want to lead. And so Aristotle would look at Priam, and if he saw Priam in the afterlife, he would say, "You did not lead a happy life, I'm sorry." Maybe they'd weep, maybe they'd drink wine together, I don't know. but Aristotle would definitely not judge Priam's life happy. On the other hand, Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, these Stoics who say, none of the external stuff matters, not your health, not your reputation, not injustice, not the death of your child. The only thing that matters is your mindset. And if you have controlled your mind such that you are able to understand how the world works and you are okay with playing the part that you had been written in this particular life, you lived as good a life as you possibly could have, and we could call you happy. And that's kind of the big difference between the Stoics and the Aristotelians, right? They're going to disagree on test cases like this, especially hard cases. Now, no one wants to be in these cases, and the tragic cases are often, exceptions or whatever. But I think that it is really helpful to take a case like this and kind of compare what's going on. With the Epicureans, it's a little less clear what they would say, but again, avoid bodily pains. Not much you can do when you're being run through with a sword or beaten to death by your grandson. Avoid psychological anxieties, right? Psychological pains. Maybe he had anxiety that prevented him from enjoying what he could while the Trojans were at, the gates, or the Greeks were at the gates. That maybe is something that they could say, and enjoying the simple pleasures. So maybe Priam was able to, enjoy barley and water and stuff like that, or whatever feast he had, or whatever morning rites he had to observe. So the Epicureans, it's less clear what they would say in this particular scenario. But I think that a lot of these theories make a lot more sense whenever you spend some time thinking about a very specific character or historical situation or something like that, and trying not just to memorize what these theories think, but how would they handle stuff that you care about, right? How would they handle this? So maybe you could think of, a movie or whatever else, right? So I want to end this with a picture of my dog, Lala there. And just to summarize, three different views on happiness. And I think Lala looks kind of happy here. Dopey, but happy, right? With Aristotle, you can consider something like eudaimonia being self-development plus luck, because it is that holistic psychological thing. Develop your reasons, be able to say why you're doing certain things, be able to say how it fits into your idea of a good life and how you're working toward that. Develop your emotions so that you feel good and at peace about doing things. Things follow naturally. You're developing your character over time, right? Plus luck. Enough wealth, enough health, enough reputation, enough friends, enough justice to be able to live an okay life, to be able to socialize with people and develop friends, to be able to contribute meaningfully to your community. Those things are luck. And so for Aristotle, happiness is self-development plus luck. By contrast, we have Stoics, so Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, and it's just about controlling your mind. It's all your mindset. That's it. That's what it comes down to, right? That's what it comes down to. Have you been able to control your thoughts, your emotions, your desires, and your values? If you haven't, you are not happy no matter how wealthy you are, right? And if you have, no matter how poor you are or destitute you are or how much pain you're in, you are happy. And then we have the Epicureans. So Epicurus and Lucretius. We didn't read Lucretius, but he's the other big one, right? Avoid pain, and that includes both bodily pain and psychological anxieties, and pursue the simple pleasures. Hunger and thirst will make any food and drink delicious. Friendship will make any time better. That's what you need to do. The natural pleasures are easy to find, and that's where you need to spend your time. Okay, so that's a lot, but that's kind of three different views. What I want you to take out of this is the Aristotelian virtue ethics. That's the most important, because the idea is the goal of life is eudaimonia, happiness. It's the complete life that's missing nothing. It's the life according to reason and virtue. And the virtues are the character traits that we possess in ourselves: right thinking, right feeling, right motivations, to do the right thing in the right way, and to do it so much that it becomes an aspect of our sort of disposition, our habits, our character, so that it becomes natural, right? And the virtues are those types of habits, dispositions, character traits that help us to achieve eudaimonia, and the vices are the things that take us further away from that. So the Aristotelian virtue ethicist, it's all about character. It's about these grand questions. What does it mean to live a good life? What kind of person do I need to become in order to achieve that? And whenever you're asking, what should you do? You always have to nest it within those questions, and you have to know particulars about that person. Who are they? What society are they living in? What kind of character do they have now? What kinds of things are they trying to achieve? You have to learn a lot about a person before you can sort of give definitive advice. Now, you can give general patterns, right? That doesn't mean that you can't. But you know that those general patterns are going to have exceptions, and that really good advice is going to include thick narratives. You have a lot of details about what's going on. Thank you so much for your attention. I'll see y'all next time.